in captivity that have influenced us to this day, believe it or not. One big thing that happened in captivity was synagogue worship. That really didn't occur until they were in Babylon. There was no temple. Temple was destroyed. They couldn't sacrifice. There was no tabernacle, no altar, no priestly line. Sacrifice stopped. They started worshiping what we call synagogue worship. So they started having, for lack of a better word, they started going to church, basically, for lack of a better word. They started going, meeting in synagogue, and that, of course, carried back from Babylon. Originally, that wasn't the case. You see Jesus teaching in the synagogue. We talk about synagogues today. Jews worship in synagogue today because there's no temple. So there's no sacrifice, no altar, no priestly line. Jews don't sacrifice. So that's a big difference. It was a big shift, and a lot of our Christian worship comes out of the form of synagogue worship. So that was a fundamental shift. There was no instruments in synagogue worship. So they read, Jesus did that. They'd read from the scripture, read from the law, and then they would discuss. There would be songs there, singing, a cappella singing, which is where that word really originated, the idea of singing without instruments. There was no instruments in synagogue. So they sang these Jewish songs, chants, songs, hymns, spiritual songs, as the scripture said, teaching and admonishing from the heart. So a lot of that form carried forward as at the time of Christ, and then a lot of that form carried into the church because the church came out of synagogue. So that was very influential in worship and in how we worship today. So that's something that came out of captivity. Captivity was a 70-year period, 70 years. 70 years they lived under the land of Babylon. And a lot happens in 70 years, right? People get married, people die, people have children. 70 years is quite a while to be gone. They establish roots, they buy houses. The Babylonians didn't carry them off and put them in concentration camps, right? The Babylonians carried them off to make them Babylonians. I mean, they didn't take them to put them in a prison. They weren't prisoners of war. They were exiles. They came to Babylon. Babylonians assimilated into their culture. You can see that in the book of Esther. When we look at Esther, Mordecai, they assimilated into their culture. They became citizens of Babylon. They carried their faith into Babylon. They proselyted people probably into Judaism from Babylon. So a lot of things happened. So when it's time to come back, according to the prophet Jeremiah, some people didn't, because their home was now in Babylon. Their home wasn't in Jerusalem anymore. That was where they were. That's where they lived. That's where their children were. That's where their jobs were, where their houses were. That's where they were. So a lot of them weren't just eager to jump on and rush back to Judea. How far is it from Babylon to Judea? Anybody got an idea? As the crow flies, a little over 600 miles. So in those days, by foot, that's a pretty good trip. And if you look at the book of Ezra, when Ezra goes back, as we begin to look at Ezra, and Nehemiah goes back, it took Ezra 4 months to get from Babylon to Judea. 4 months. So that's a pretty good trip. Pretty good journey, right? 4 months with a bunch of people. That's a pretty good trip. And along the way, what do they have? They have all these articles of gold and silver, as we're going to see, all these temple articles. They went through lands of people that weren't friendly, right? And Jennifer sent me a text the other night. We talked about that a little bit. You know, it wasn't that policed, right? I mean, they're 600 miles away from Babylon. They're not just going to rush to your aid if something happens. You're just kind of on your own. So it was difficult. It was a lot of faith to make that trip. A lot of faith to go back. And Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible are one book. In our Bible, they're separated into 2 separate books. And Ezra goes back first. Ezra's going to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah will rebuild the wall. So this is kind of that journey back from Babylonian captivity to, and it was during, my thing will flip, Shannon, I'm not going anywhere. It was during the time of, Jeremiah says it, this whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then it will be when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity, the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. Jeremiah 29, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place. So this is all prophetic, very prophetic, and very much a fulfilled prophecy. And if you look at Daniel, haven't exactly broke this new Bible in yet. If you look at Daniel chapter 9, this was Daniel. Of course, he's now under the Medes by Daniel chapter 9. And he is, we'll get there. And if you look at Daniel 9, it says, the first year of Darius, the son of Aharsis, of Median descent. So these are the Medes, who is made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, which is exactly what this is saying. The Chaldeans have been conquered, so they were by the Medes. In the first year of the reign, I, Daniel, observed the books, in the books, the number of years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, Alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned, committed iniquity. If you drop down a little ways, drop down into about verse 12. For thus he has confirmed his words which he has spoken against us, against our rulers who ruled us, to bring on us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what was done to Jerusalem. As it was written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come on us. You have not sought the favor of the Lord our God by turning from our iniquity and giving attention to your truth. Therefore the Lord has kept calamity in store and brought it on us. For the Lord our God is righteous with respect to all his deeds. So basically, Jeremiah is saying, or Daniel is saying, Jeremiah says 70 years. It's been 70 years. It's time to go home. Time to go back. So Gabriel comes, the angel Gabriel comes in verse 20 of Daniel 9. Gabriel comes to see Daniel. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin, it says, still speaking to prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of evening offering, and gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplication, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding to the vision. And that's where he gets into the 70 weeks. So basically, Daniel knew Jeremiah's prophecy. Daniel knew it was time to go back. Daniel's asking God when that will occur. And now, because of God's providence, as you see in the beginning of the book of Ezra, according to God's providence, Cyrus, the king of Persia, and if you look at this in Ezra, it's all God's thing here. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he sent proclamation throughout his kingdom, put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Now, you got to remember, this text is a little bit biased, right? I mean, this is from the perspective of this is all done by God, and God put in place, which God did. But, you know, Cyrus, the Medes, didn't just allow the Jews to go home. So it's a little bit of a biased text. They didn't just allow the Jews to go home. They allowed all these captured nations to return. So this isn't necessarily like, the way you read it in Ezra, it's kind of like it's just the Jews. But that's not true. When nations captured nations in the Old Testament, they always wanted to carry their false gods back to their place because they wanted people to know that their gods were better than the gods of the people they captured. Now, unfortunately, for the Babylonians, there's a real issue with that with the Jews, because guess what? The Jews don't have any images of what? No images of God, right? So there was nothing for them to carry back except for what was in the temple. There's no images. There's no graven images. There's no statues of God. in Jerusalem. So you can't carry the God of Israel back to Babylon, essentially, because they didn't do that. There was no graven images, no molten images, no idols, so they can't do that. So what they have is all these articles of the temple that they brought back, but they didn't destroy them. You think they would bring them back and they would just melt them down for the gold and melt them down for the silver and just to destroy them and they would just be gone. But they didn't do that for the large part. Now, some things were, and interestingly, in this story, side note, there's no ark, right? The Ark of the Covenant is strangely gone at this point in history and will never return again, right? A lot of speculation about that, what happened to the ark. So the ark of the Lord is gone from this point on. Some people think the Babylonians carried it off and destroyed it, but according to 2 Maccabees, apocryphal book, Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, the prophet Jeremiah said he took it and hid it in a cave on the mount, which would be Mount Moriah, that no man will ever find. That's what 2 Maccabees says, that Jeremiah took the ark before Babylon was captured and hid it, and it will never be found. Some people say the Babylonians carried it off. Personally, I think it's the ninja nuns of Ethiopia that have the ark. That's my story. You got to Google that, because if you have never Googled that, you got to Google the ninja warriors of the ark of Ethiopia or Africa, wherever it is, because they say they've got it, and the ninja monks are protecting it, so you can't see it. And if you go in there, you get killed by ninja monks. It's really a good story. You can Google that for yourself. But anyway, however it goes, the ark is not around. So the ark's one thing they're not going to bring back. And the ark will never come back. And we don't know where the ark is, actually. And I'm sure the ark will never be revealed to us again. So that's one thing that is definitely, one article of the temple that is definitely absent at this particular point. So he wants to go back to Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which Judah, rebuild the house of the Lord. So he's going to go. He's going to say, if you want to go, you can go. If you don't want to go, you don't have to go. But then it says every survivor at whatever place should give to this mission, give to this quest. Give goods and cattle, and give silver and gold, and the heads of the households of Judah and Benjamin. In this one place, you see Benjamin kind of creeping back in a little bit. The priests and the Levites arose, and everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord. So they're going up to rebuild the temple. Rebuild the temple and the Temple Mount. The temple's been destroyed. It's totally in ruins. Nothing left. Been burned. Everything's been torn down. It's just the mount that's left. All those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, gold, goods, cattle, valuables. Nebuchadnezzar had carried away. Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and put in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Merodach the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So all these things Cyrus is just going to send back. All this gold, all this silver, all these articles of the temple. Cyrus is just going to send those back with him. So he's just going to open it up, give it back. He's letting them go back. And we talked, and so they're going to become, well, we'll get into that in a minute. So they're going to take all these back to the temple. 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29 duplicates, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls of a second kind. So 4,500 articles of silver and gold in the end. 4,500 articles of silver and gold. So you get the idea of the scope of this project. This is a big project. But on the other hand, what you got to remember is, it's pretty valuable, right? Silver and gold. So they're pretty vulnerable to nations around them. They're pretty vulnerable to attack. They're pretty vulnerable to this happening because that's a lot of wealth. So it's kind of a scary deal. So they're going to be 4 months on the road with all these things. They're going to go to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem doesn't have a wall, doesn't have protection, doesn't have fortification. So this is a big deal. And this is where Nehemiah is going to start to get involved, right? We're not to Nehemiah, but this is what Nehemiah is going to, this is what's going to make Nehemiah want to go back, is I need to build a wall, need to build protection, need to give them protection from their enemies. So there's a process involved here with this return back to Jerusalem. Is it these are the people, the province who came with Nebuchadnezzar? So all these people he carried off. The number of the men of the people of Israel, the son of Pharaoh. So we get into this. We're not going to read all this. So why is it important? Is the question. You know, why do we know? There's not a lot of people going back compared to how many left if you put the numbers down. It's not like I mean, it's quite a few people, several thousand, don't get me wrong, but it's not anything like what left. So why is it important? Households, names. The first part of chapter 2, it talks about people going back by the household name. The second part of chapter 2 is people going back by the city of their origin. In other words, because there's all these different regions in Judea, these little bitty regions. So it goes back to which region all these different people came from. So there's a lot of speculation about that people are having a hard time even tracing back their lineage to where they originally went. Why is it important? Why are names important in the Bible? Genealogies, names. The lineage is part of it. Lineage is part of it. But it's a bigger God thing than that. What do you say, Sam? Got any thoughts? Yeah, you really had to prove your line. I mean, that was it. You had to prove your lineage. That's how you knew you were truthfully a Jew. And Jews still do that today. Muslims are big on that, tracing their lineage back to Ishmael. I mean, back to Abraham. So it's the same thing. And those cultures, to prove it was not just your decision to be, it was your birth. It was your birthright. So it was a bigger thing than that. Roll numbers for Indians, right? Kind of that thing. It was a bigger thing. It was a birthright. But there's another reason, I think, that God does this. In Exodus, which we call it Exodus because it's the Exodus out of Egypt, but the Hebrews call that the book of names because the very first part of Exodus says these are the names of the sons of Israel. You know, names are important to God. Have you ever noticed that in the Bible? That names are very important to God. Have you ever noticed that? Names are, in the book of life, what's written there? Your name, right? Names are really, really important in the Bible. Really, really important to God. And there's a reason. I think it's a God reason for that. Because I think God's telling us that individuals are important. You know, your name's important. It's not just abstract. All these people, right? It's your name, right? Have you ever went to a party or went to some place and they had to see if your name was on the list? And if your name wasn't on the list, I haven't been to many parties in my life because I'm not that important, but I see that on the TV all the time. Is your name on the list? You know, so if your name ain't on the list, you can't go because you have to. Your name has. But we're going to go to that party, right? And when we get to that party in heaven, when we die, what are they going to check to see if our name's on the what? That's it, right? So names are important, and God wants us to know that. And God wants these people to know that. They're forgotten. They've been carried off into exile. And now, guess what? I still know your name, right? You've been carried off into exile. You've been carried off, but I still know who you are. And that's exactly what he did with the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. That's the reason Exodus starts with these are the names, because he wants them to know. You've been here 400 years in Egypt, and you've been slaves for 400 years. I haven't forgotten you. I know who you are. I know your name. Right? Isn't that important in life for people to know your name? Right? Salesmen, people, if anybody tries to sell you anything, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to wear your name out. They're going to learn your name, right? Because they want it to be personal. And that's exactly, I think, what this is. It's personal to God. These are the people. These are the ones who are going back. And I think it's important. And so we get all these lists of people that are going back, all of chapter 2, basically. And then at the end of chapter 2, we get this idea that of just exactly what Sam was saying. This idea that if you don't remember, then the Urim and the Thummim is going to determine. What's the Urim and the Thummim? Where are those at? What are those? Well, they're stones, right? Where were they kept? Behind the ephod of the high priest, right? And they were used for divining the will of God. The Urim and the Thummim. They were used for divining the will of God. And if you've ever studied Mormonism, the Mormons have an Urim and a Thummim. Interestingly enough, you can Google that too. So they still divine the will of God with an Urim and a Thummim. So anyway, but that's what it was. And so basically it's saying that those searched among the ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. So if you couldn't trace your lineage, just like Sam said, you were excluded. And the governor said they should not eat from the most holy things until a priest stood up with the Urim and the Thummim. So in other words, they were going to divine whether they were or not. And the whole assembly was 42,000, besides their male and female servants. They had singing men and women. I don't know exactly why that's included in there, but it is 200 of them. And they had horses, and they had mules, and they had camels, and they had a whole bunch of donkeys. So you always have a bunch of donkeys. Like donkeys must proliferate. I don't know about donkeys, but there's always a lot of donkeys in the Bible. So, but anyway, this is this big thing that's going back. They're going back to Judah, and they, when they arrived at the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem, they made sacrifice. They offered willingly to restore the foundation to their ability. They gave in priestly garments, gold and silver. The priests and Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants lived in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So they all disbanded back to the cities where they were, and they started to rebuild their life, and now you got to rebuild the temple. So if you're going to rebuild the temple, there's things that have to be done about the temple, certain things. Temple is holy, sacred, godly. So when you build the temple, there's certain things you have to do. What are some of the things we know about building the temple? The altar, number one. What about the altar? The altar has to be made out of what? What kind of stones? Huh? Uncut. Uncut stones, right? You can't put a tool on an altar stone. So the altar has to be made of uncut stones. And when you go to rebuild the foundation of the temple, since they didn't pour concrete like we do today, foundations were made out of stone, right? So when you went to lay your foundation, what is it about the stones of the temple do we know? They got a cornerstone, but couldn't be the sound of a hammer, right? Couldn't be the sound of any tool at the temple site. So all the stones had to be hewn and carried. Couldn't have the sound of any kind of a mason. Couldn't have the sound of any kind of a stone or a hammer or a chisel or any of those things at the temple. So every stone had to be hewn at a remote location and carried to the temple and fitted together. And they were cut so square that they just fit on top of each other. There was no mortar. They just fit on top of each other. And that's how come the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 71 AD, because when the temple was burned, Titus said, don't destroy the temple when the Romans took Jerusalem. But the temple was burned, and when it was burned, all the gold and the silver articles flowed in between the cracks of the stones where the stones were put, because there's no mortar. And so the Romans took big bars and levers, and they pried the stones off each other to get to the gold and silver that ran between the stones. And what Jesus said in Matthew, where he said, not one stone will be left upon another, exactly what happened, because they pried those stones apart to get to that stuff that ran between them when the temple burned. So there was no mortar. So these things were hewn. I know some of you in here are carpenters or do carpentry, but it's just always been amazing to me that by hand, they made those things so square and flat and plain that they could build this temple without it even being there. And then I always thought, boy, wouldn't it be bad when you got there and like it was off just a little bit, and you're like, now we got to haul this thing all the way back out there and chisel a little more off of it and haul it all the way back, see if it fits, right? So that's just my brain thinking. But anyway, I always thought it's quite the deal. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to do the altar. That's the first thing they're going to do. They arose and built the altar of God of Israel to offer burnt offerings, and it is written in the law of Moses, a man of God. So they set up the altar on its foundation, for they were terrified because of the peoples of the lands, and they offered burnt offerings to the Lord. So they're scared, so they're going to start offering these offerings because they're wanting to appease the will of God. They had to do this in the temple. Jews weren't authorized to offer were not authorized to sacrifice anywhere but the temple. That was a lot of what we read about in Kings, where they were sacrificing in the high places. And God wasn't pleased with that. You had to go to the temple. You had to be done in the temple. So without a temple, no sacrifice. So once the altar was back at the temple site, then they were able to sacrifice on this temple, and they were able to start these sacrifices. And they celebrated the Feast of Booths. 3 big Jewish feast days. 3 big Jewish feast days. Passover, Pentecost, Booths. Right? Those are the 3 big feast days for the Jews. Passover, you know what that is. Celebrate the Passover of the angel of death over the children of Israel in the land of Egypt. Passover. Pentecost, 50 days after Passover Sabbath. Pentecost. So Pentecost is 50 days after Sabbath. Sabbath is on what day? Saturday. So 50 days after Sabbath would be on what day? Sunday, right? So the church started on Sunday because it's 50 days after Pentecost Sabbath, right? There's 7 days in a week, so Pentecost Sabbath, 49 days would be Sabbath, right? Saturday. Pentecost, 50th day, first day of the week. So what day did the church start on? First day of the week, right? Pentecost. So anyway, that was the next one, which is also called the Feast of Ingathering. And then there's no, it wasn't Ingathering. That was the Feast of Planting, right? And then Booths is the Feast of Ingathering. Feast of Booths, and that's where you're supposed to make tents, and people would live in tents on the roofs of their houses or in tents. That's why they called it the Feast of Booths. And it was because of their traveling from Egypt back, and it was also the Feast of the Ingathering. It was the time of harvest. So that was the last feast of the year. So that tells you kind of when they got there. So this is in the fall. This is Feast of Booths. So that's the third of the big feast days. There was a continued burnt offering for new moons and fixed festivals of the Lord that were consecrated. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple had not been laid. Now, this is where you get into Haggai and Zechariah, okay? Because Haggai and Zechariah are restoration prophets, minor prophets, okay? Haggai and Zechariah. And those guys prophesied to tell the Israelites to get on it and get the thing built. That's my summary of Haggai and Zechariah. Get on it and get it built. Because these people got there, they got the altar done, they're going to lay the foundation, and then they're lollygagging, right? And they're not getting it done. So how long do you think it's going to take them to build the temple? I'm open for guesses here. How long is it going to take? So eventually God says, enough's enough, right? I'm sending Haggai and Zechariah, and they're going to lay it on you to get this thing done because you've taken too long. So how long's too long? Nope, not there. 2 decades. 20 years. It's going to take them to get this done. 20 years. God isn't happy. He says. So in the midst of all this temple building, the prophet Haggai and the prophet Zechariah come along and say, get with the program and get this thing done because 20 years is too long to build this temple. So even though we seem to read this pretty fast, it took quite a while for all this to happen, is the point I'm trying to make. 20 years to get this done. So, well, the Lord started the first fire. I mean, yeah, you're getting way back now. So, but I think that was, that was definitely was extinguished at some point. So, yeah. No, I don't think so. And then the temple at the time of Christ, this temple will never be destroyed, actually, technically, until the Romans destroy it. But at the time of Christ, we call it Herod's temple because Herod went in and redid all this and made it really, very beautiful. This was kind of a thrown together thing in the end. This wasn't anything like Solomon's temple. They're going to get cedars from Lebanon. They're going to do things, but it's just not really what it should have been for a lot of reasons, right? So Herod will start to rebuild the temple, and Herod will not finish that until after Jesus is crucified and risen from the dead, actually about 10 years after Jesus, 10 to 15 years after Jesus is resurrected, before the actual Herod's temple in Jerusalem will actually be completed. And then it took Herod 46 years to rebuild the temple. 46. Throwing that out there. To rebuild the temple and the courts and everything that he did. 46 years. 71 AD, the Romans come, tear the thing down, destruction of Jerusalem. And now, if you ever watch the news, the Jews go to the what at the Temple Mount? The Wailing Wall, right? And the Wailing Wall is part of the retaining wall that Herod built to support the outer courts of the temple. It's not the temple. It's not any part of the actual structure of the temple. The Wailing Wall is actually, it's on a mount, the Temple Mount, and it's on a retaining wall to hold that back, to hold that earth back for that hill. But that is part, that was part of the original retaining wall of the temple of Herod's temple. So that's why the Jews still hold that to be sacred. So that kind of fills you in on a little bit of that. Are there any questions here? Masons were honored, we talk about that. That was a real craft, of course, at that time, to be able to work with stone. And of course, these guys were supposed to be the best of the best that laid these. There's a lot of biblical references to that. Cornerstones, Jesus being the chief cornerstone, the idea of that idea of Masons and what goes on with them. They bought wood from the cedars of Lebanon, which is exactly what Solomon did when he built the temple originally. He got wood from the cedars of Lebanon. The temples were magnificent. The temple of Herod's was magnificent beyond a doubt. If you ever read the story of Jesus, the crucifixion of Christ, and the veil of the temple being rent from top to bottom when Jesus was crucified, they said the beam across that held that curtain was 15,000 pounds. That beam, stone beam across the top of that, and the curtain itself was 3 inches thick without seams woven. 3 inches thick, 10 centimeters. So that curtain was 3 inches thick woven. So when that curtain ripped, when Jesus, you think, oh, well, the curtain tore. You think a curtain like what we think a curtain. Ripped from the top to the bottom, right? Curtains don't rip from top to bottom. They rip from bottom to top because there was wear on the bottom and fray, and that's where. So when that curtain of the temple tore, when Jesus was crucified, and the curtain tore, that would have been something to see, just saying. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, says the beam that held the curtain broke in half, and the temple and the curtain was rent that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And that curtain, I can't remember how tall, but I want to say it was 30 feet tall, 3 inches thick, and that curtain ripped in half. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So, and this happened when Jesus was crucified. So, a lot of stuff, a lot of history, a lot of Bible, a lot of stuff going on with all this. The priests, the Levites who came from captivity, the Levites are still of that tribe. There's 24 divisions of Levites under David. 24 divisions. 24 different family divisions of Levites under King David. And those divisions were all separated into groups that did different things with the temple. At the time of Ezra, 4 groups of Levites at the time of Ezra. By the time of Christ, 24 groups of Levites again at the time of Christ. But at the time of Ezra, 4 groups of Levites is all there was that were involved in the temple. 4 different, basically, households, Levitical households. Under Hosea, yeah. No, it was after. That was Hosea, so this is after captivity. That was before captivity. Now this is after captivity. And as we get into Ezra, he's going to read the law. Right. Eventually, they're going to publicly read the law again. And Nehemiah will publicly read the law. So they'll read it out loud. The law out loud. We're out of time. Any great questions? Okay. Thanks for your time this evening. Yeah, go ahead, Ron. Oh, yeah, she's slacking. You know how they are, them kids. Try to